November, month of mists and mellow fruitfulness, or actually here, just month of storms and clouds. So a perfect time to get some reading done. And this month, quite a few of my books actually had a watery theme, which fit with the constant driving rain outside the windows. I read 8 books this November and DNF'd 1, 2 non-fiction and 6 fiction, which is more non-fiction than I normally read, to be honest. And I had a pretty good month. There's a couple of 5 stars here and probably a contender for one of my top books of the year, but also a couple of disappointments as well. I don't know if my camera's going to focus on me or in this watery lady. The first book I read this month was Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield, which was a 5-star for me. I've had this on my TBR for ages, so I was really pleased that I enjoyed it when I got around to it. If you haven't come across this one, it's about a lesbian couple called Leah and Miri. Leah is a scientist who goes on deep sea missions, and she goes off on this submarine mission that ends up lasting months longer than it's meant to. And when she comes back, she's changed. There's something different about her. And the narrative split between Miri, her wife, who's like caring for her and trying to figure out what happened, and so much has changed in their relationship. And then also we hear from Leah during the submarine trip and get a bit of a glimpse of what's going on there. It really is about grieving in lots of different ways, and about what a marriage looks like and a marriage in grief, alongside some watery cosmic horror. I really enjoyed this. I think it's got beautiful writing. It's quite literary in how it's written, but at the same time there is the mystery of what actually happened under the sea, so a bit of a combination of kind of feeling, writing and plot. Second book I read this month was Green Grass, Running Water by Thomas King. This is the second Thomas King I've read, and I really enjoyed both of them. This was another 5-star for me, my top read of the month. King is an Indigenous Canadian author, and Green Grass, Running Water weaves together several different stories of members of a Blackfoot clan getting ready for their Sundance, dealing with relationship issues, dead-end jobs and family commitments. And at the same time, it tells the story of several different Indigenous North American creation myths. But it doesn't just tell these stories in a straightforward way, it combines them with lots of influences from Christianity and from Western popular culture to comment on myth making and how we value different kinds of stories within society. So along with the human characters, we also have the trickster god Coyote. We have various figures from Christianity who kind of crop up in slightly different ways, like Noah, Jesus, and maybe even God as well. And we have these 4 immortal elders that travel around interfering in everyone's lives, and they shapeshift between different fictional and mythological characters. And the book is funny as well. It's talking about religion, it's talking about storytelling, it's talking about the interplay between Indigenous and Western stories, and it's also talking about control over Indigenous land and waterways. But it does it all with this rich sense of humour that's really, really enjoyable, and something that I also appreciate about the other Thomas King book I've read, The Back of the Turtle, which similarly played with characters from different mythological traditions, contemporary Indigenous land issues, and humour. And I'd love to revisit this one. It's a book that you can just read straight through and really enjoy as a story, but then you can also kind of pick it apart and notice lots of references that maybe you missed the first time. Like after this, I went looking and ended up skimming through academic articles on it. So there's a real literary depth, as well as just a really enjoyable storytelling experience. So the next book I read was Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, which I listened to on audiobook. It's narrated by Naomi Klein herself, which I think works quite well because it's a fairly personal story, although she's not like a professional actor or audiobook narrator, so it's not as good narration as you do find in some other stories. I read this for my book club. I gave it 3.5 stars. It's a very expansive book. It covers lots of different topics around the politics and society of the current day, and the framing of it all is Naomi Klein discussing how she often gets confused with Naomi Wolf, who is also a journalist and writer, but who has kind of moved into the right wing and conspiracy territory in recent years. So Klein talks about this doppelganger effect and what it's like to have someone else in the public eye who you get confused with. And she uses this framing of doppelgangers to talk through a whole range of different issues, including conspiracies around COVID vaccinations, the rise of the alt-right in America and Canada, discourse around autism and the harms that have been done by the autism vaccine myth, and of course, because it's Naomi Klein, the injustices of global capitalism. So a few things I think this book does really well. I think it covers a lot of topics in a pretty accessible way. Klein is a really good writer and she can pull out specific examples and explain them in a way that seems so obvious after she's explained it that you wonder kind of why you didn't notice these connections before. And I think it is fair to have such a wide-reaching book because it enables Klein to point out that there are a lot of connections between different things like nationalism, capitalism. She ties these all together in various examples, like the trucker protest in Canada, or in one of the more effective sections, her experiences visiting Israel as a Jewish American journalist with sympathies for Palestinians. And I'm politically pretty aligned with Naomi Klein, so I agree with a lot of the arguments and points that she's making. I think that the doppelganger motif that she weaves throughout the whole book does get a bit thin in some parts, like not everything is a doppelganger, but I respect that her intention in using it was to tie all of these themes together and point out connections in social and political systems, and I think that's really important, and she does it well. This didn't end up being a higher rating than a 3.5 for me, just because I felt that it was a little unfocused. She goes quite into depth in various topics. It's a fairly long book, so it's a great resource and an impressive amount of work, but not necessarily the most accessible text. If someone wanted more of an introduction to a left-wing approach to lots of these issues, like the rise of the right, conspiracy theories, capitalism, this isn't necessarily the text that I would recommend, but I would still recommend it to people who already have more of a grounding in those issues and would enjoy reading a bit more, or if you've previously enjoyed Naomi Klein. My rating's always a bit of a combination between just my personal enjoyment and experience and a more objective sense of the value of the prose or the ideas behind a book. So that 3.5 kind of reflects that I didn't actually love reading this. It's not very jolly and it's quite long and it sometimes goes off on itself. But at the same time, there were moments that I thought were really good and I appreciate what she was trying to do. The fourth book I read in November is called Waiting for the Last Bus. It's a slim little number and it's the other non-fiction that I read. This is by Richard Holloway, who used to be the Bishop of Edinburgh, and he's quite a well-known Anglican bishop. This was also a 3.5 for me. It's subtitled Reflections on Life and Death. Holloway was in his 80s when he wrote this. He's now, I believe, in his 90s. And it's him talking through different ways to think about death, different thoughts he has about it, drawing from different religious traditions, including, of course, Christianity, talking about poetry, talking about funerals that he's performed for friends. And it's a very thoughtful, peaceful book. He draws on a lot of poems. He clearly has a love for literature and sees a lot of beauty in the world. He's also, I think, described as an agnostic bishop, so he has had doubts and he's not certain about his perspective on God or on the afterlife or anything like that. So it's not him expressing a purely Christian worldview on death, it's more of a philosophical musing. And there wasn't anything really groundbreaking in here, but what he kept coming back to was just the importance of living a good life in terms of being good to other people. Whether or not there is life after death, the meaning of life now is about doing good in the world and loving others. The next book I read this month was The Impusium by Olga Tokarczuk. This is the second book by Tokarczuk I've read. The first one was Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead. And this was 4 stars for me. I was hoping to really love it and I didn't, but I did enjoy it and I was intrigued by it. It's set in 1913, just before the First World War, in Central Europe, in what is now Poland. The main character is a young man with TB who goes to the mountains to a resort for wellness where people go to take the air and to receive treatments for their lungs. And this was a real place, it's a real treatment that happened and did work to a certain extent to help fight TB. He's staying in a guest house of other men receiving treatment and they barely see any women. There's kind of one female character in the house who disappears very quickly and there aren't many women in the town either. So what you get is this group of men spending a lot of time together, spending a lot of time in enforced rest and having conversations representing different philosophical and political viewpoints from different European traditions, talking about life, talking about society, but often talking about women really misogynistically. And this is Tokarczuk pointing out how lots of the words of the canon of European literature and philosophy are really misogynistic. So there's opinions in here from Shakespeare, from Ovid, she lists them at the back of the book. All sorts of famous people like Jack Kerouac, D.H. Lawrence, Richard Wagner. And this misogyny is reflected in the town where they're staying, which has a history of witch hunts. And there's a folk story that all the women of the town once ran off into the forest to escape persecution. So there's 2 narratives playing alongside each other here. There's this young man who's quite quiet, reserved, and is trying to figure out how to be a man in this masculine society more broadly, and also in the very male-dominated guest house where he's staying. And then there's also this absence of women, and yet this constant presence of misogyny and thought about women. And I really enjoyed these themes and some of the moments and conversations that arise, and there's this creeping edge to it all, this kind of supernatural discomfort that Tokarczuk does really well. But I didn't love it. I think it was a little bit dense for me to really grab hold of it. I would have appreciated a little bit more of the folk horror side of things and maybe slightly fewer examples of how lots of dead philosophers are misogynistic. Next is the only book I DNF'd this month. I don't DNF many books. This was an audiobook of We Cast a Shadow by Maurice Carlos Ruffin. It's a satirical race story. It's been compared a lot to The Sellout, which I did quite enjoy. It's about a black man living in a version of America where the racism of America is dialed up to extremes. So lots and lots of black men are incarcerated and black people are massively underrepresented in professional workplaces. He's a relatively successful lawyer navigating a white workplace, and he has a mixed race son, and his goal is that one day he'll be able to afford for his son to get surgery that will make him white passing. So it's got this kind of dialed up, almost comical take on racism, similar to The Sellout and its discussion of slavery. It also reminded me a bit of the film Sorry to Bother You, which I really liked. I got maybe a third of the way through and I just found I didn't care about any of the characters. I didn't really care about what was happening, and actually things were moving quite slowly. I didn't feel any urgency to find out what was going to go on with this guy or with his son. Maybe if I'd been reading it in print, I might have had a better time. Sometimes I find audiobooks work really well for me and sometimes I zone out. So unfortunately this just wasn't a win for me this time. Then next I read Open Water by Caleb Azumah Nelson. This is another really short one, less than 150 pages, maybe more of a novella than a novel. And unfortunately this was a 2.5 for me. It's the story of two young black British people who meet, who fall in love, and whose relationship is shaped and affected by societal and personal racism that they experience. It has a strong theme running throughout of black art, black film, and black music. The main male character is often connecting his thoughts to different songs, albums, films, pieces of art that he's experienced. And in my opinion, this could have worked really well as a long-form lyrical essay about black art and its intersection with racism and its beauty and power and creativity, connecting a lot of these ideas together. As a novel, it just didn't work for me. I didn't connect with either of these characters. It's told in the second person, so you are doing this, which sometimes I really enjoy. Some people don't like it. I have enjoyed that in the past. I didn't like it here. I didn't feel that I cared particularly about these two. I didn't feel that I knew why they loved each other. It's an insta-love situation, so I wasn't invested in the relationship. And I also think at times the writing was just a bit overdone for me. It got a little bit purple, a little bit Tumblr poetry quotes, which just meant that I couldn't take the story seriously. I think the strongest points that Azumah Nelson is making are probably those connections between black culture and racism and how both shape each other and shape society. But in a novel form, they really didn't work. I don't enjoy reading a novel and then partway through getting a paragraph about like a particular Frank Ocean song. It can really take me out of it sometimes, having those really, really specific details that tell you exactly when a book was written. And I feel that I would have enjoyed the points that Azumah Nelson was making and some of the connections in a non-fiction format. But lots of people did enjoy this one, so it might have just been me. Next, I read a book called Cruel Candy by Mildred Abbott. This is the first in a series called The Cozy Corgi Mysteries. This is not my usual kind of thing, cozy mystery, but I really enjoyed it. I came across these books that are all about a woman and her pet corgi kind of solving murders in a Colorado town, and I thought they sounded pretty funny and decided to give them a go. I did a full recap review of this book while baking a recipe from the book in my previous video, so you can check that out if you want to hear more. But essentially it's pretty classic, small town, someone comes in, someone gets murdered, a woman who is not at all involved with the police, it's not at all her dog, it's not at all her job, decides to investigate the murder, and there's a cast of kooky characters as you go along. But it was well written, it was funny, it was quite pacey, it's not too long, and I'll check out another one of these in the future, so I gave that one 4 stars. And then finally, this month I read Haven by Emma Donoghue. I read The Pull of the Stars a few months ago and devoured it in one day, and then picked up some more Emma Donoghue to read off the back of that, and this was one of those. Haven is the story of 3 7th century Irish monks who set off to find an island where they can live in a kind of hermitage, not interacting with anyone else in society, as a religious mission. One of the monks is incredibly committed to the mission and religious to the point of fanaticism, while the other 2 have slightly different backstories, they've lived different lives, and so they have a different relationship with the world around them. And to a large extent it is about that. It's about these men arriving on an island populated by birds, and the relationship that each of them has with the water, with the birds, with the land is shaped by their worldviews. They have a very tough time of it setting up this tiny monastery. There's very little food, there's very little shelter, and this leads perhaps inevitably to interpersonal and spiritual conflict towards the end of the book, which I really enjoyed. I think Donoghue did this really well. It just took too long to get there. So I gave this 4 stars. It could have been 5 for me with different pacing. As it was, I just felt that we spent so long in the middle section of the book, whereas the first and last sections were very quickly dealt with. So I enjoyed it, and I'm sure I'll pick up other Emma Donoghue books in the future, but it wasn't a love. So overall in November I read 8 books. That's pretty normal for me, and then I DNF'd 1 according to my story graph. That's 2,223 pages and 17 hours of audiobook listening. That's probably a bit low on pages compared to some months. A couple of these books were pretty short. And an average rating of 3.94, which I'm happy with, although I think I am quite a generous rater. I don't tend to give under 3 stars unless I was actively kind of rolling my eyes at the book. So 3.94 is not amazing, but my 2 5-stars this month, Our Wives Under the Sea and Greengrass Running Water, were both excellent books, and Greengrass Running Water is definitely going to be one of my top books of the year. I had a bit of a watery theme with Greengrass Running Water, Our Wives Under the Sea, open water, and also in Haven, the sea is a really important character. So that reflected the torrential rain that I had this month. Hopefully December's going to be a bit sunnier, and I'll read some sunnier books to go along with it. Let me know if you read any of these ones, what you thought of them, or what your top November picks were. If you want to check out the chaos that is me trying to bake while recapping the whole of Cruel Candy by Mildred Abbott, you can take a look at that one here. And otherwise, I'll see you next time.